Hi, welcome to the League of Women Voters Community Forum. This is going to be Open Primaries 101, and with Jeremy Gruber. And I would like to introduce Fran Wagner, who's recently been president of the League of Women Voters of Kentucky, but she is now serving as chair of our study on open primaries and ranked choice voting. So we're very excited about that. The League is known for not only our voter outreach and education, but also for studying issues that have impact on voters. And so this is an exciting study that we're just starting the process of learning about open primaries. So I'm actually going to turn it over to Fran, who will introduce our speaker. And so welcome to Fran Wagner. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Jen. Tonight we're beginning an exploration of open primaries. At the League's annual meeting in June, we adopted a study of open primaries and ranked choice voting. And so tonight we're going to be focusing on the open primaries part of that. And I want you to know that we're forming a committee, a study committee, that we're just getting started. And if you're interested in working on the committee, by all means, we'd love to have you.
Hello.
Just let me know. You can email me at fran.wagner@lwvky.org. So I'm easy to reach, and we can talk about how you could be part of the study, which would be wonderful. Now, once the committee has done its study and we've got the pros and cons of different voting procedures, every local league is then going to be conducting small group meetings to determine if the Kentucky League should take a position on open primaries and ranked choice voting, and if so, what that position should be. So anyway, tonight, it's open primaries as our subject. And as you probably know, Kentucky has a system of closed primaries. By that meaning that if you want to vote in the Republican primary, you have to be a registered Republican. If you want to vote in the Democratic primary, you have to be a registered Democrat. And if you are not registered in either party, then you don't get primaries. And as we're going to find out, actually in the South, we're a minority for being a closed primary. So the question is that a good system? Should we select our candidates for office in another way? Or should we just stick with what we have? So we're fortunate tonight to have with us a lawyer and an expert on election law and policy to help us sort out and analyze the many different approaches that states take to nominating their candidates for public office. Jeremy Gruber is a senior vice president of Open Primaries Incorporated, and an organization that promotes, as you might expect from the name, open primaries. Jeremy is the author of 3 books, dozens of articles, and a nationally recognized expert in this field. Incidentally, I'm going to turn it over to Jeremy here in just a second. But if you have questions as his presentation goes along, please put them in the chat. And at the end of his remarks, we'll try to get to as many of the questions as we can. So without further ado, Jeremy, welcome. We are so glad to have you with us, and take it from here.
Well, thank you for that introduction, and hi, everybody. It's a real pleasure to be with you. I'm going to share my screen and start with a presentation that I hope will, let's see, get us to where we want to go. Can you all see my screen?
Yes, and could you increase your volume just a little, Jeremy?
Sure. How's that better?
Yeah.
Okay. I have the air conditioning on, so I'll turn that off too. It's still hot here. So as Fran said, my name is Jeremy Gruber. I'm the Senior Vice President for open primaries. We're a national nonpartisan organization working to open primary elections to every voter and making them more inclusive. And I wanted to kind of start from the beginning. Why do we have primaries? Well, 100 years ago, we didn't. Primaries are actually a relatively new part of how we vote in this country. 100 years ago and before that, we didn't have primaries. So voters only got to vote in November. But what they increasingly found over years was that by the time they showed up to the polls in November, all the decisions had already been made for them. There was very little for them to opine on in the general election, because in the months leading up to the general election, the party leaders and the special interests would get together in those proverbial smoke-filled back rooms, and they would cut deals on party platforms. They would select candidates. They would horse trade. And by the time voters showed up, it had all been done for them. So what happened is, during the progressive era of the early 20th century, when a lot of reforms were happening, the direct election of senators, for example, we used to elect senators from the state legislature. It wasn't a direct election. There was a lot of changes going on in making our elections much more of a direct democracy, and primaries were a big part of that, because the public wanted to make sure that from the very beginning of the election season, they had the ability to directly intervene and help select the candidates and set the agenda. So from the beginning, primaries were not designed for or created for the parties. They were actually created so that the public could have a driver's seat during the beginning of the election process. And the parties actually fought primaries for years. For years, they didn't like the idea of primaries. So it actually took 50 years until the 1960s when primary elections became commonly used. Now, there's a number of different forms of primary elections. The very basic form of the term open primary connotes that all voters get to participate in the primary, because, of course, in a closed primary, as Fran mentioned, only members of a party can participate. So Republicans in a Republican Party, Democrats in a Democrat Party primary. 38 states now have some form of an open primary, and it's very much a patchwork of various forms of open primaries all around the country. 20 states have a combination of an open primary with nonpartisan voter registration. This is the dominant mode of primary election in the South. Almost every southern state has this, other than Kentucky and Florida, if you count Florida, has this form of a primary, where when you go to register with the state, you do not, unlike Kentucky, register as a Republican or as a Democrat or otherwise. You simply register as a voter. You still have party primaries, a Republican Party primary and a Democratic Party primary, but in these 20 states, by virtue of the fact that you are not registered as a party member, everybody picks a ballot. So however you might think of yourself, you might think of yourself as a Republican, a Democrat, you're actually, in the eyes of the state, just a voter. And everybody picks a ballot, one or the other, you get one, and gets to participate. Now, 10 states with partisan voter registration, like Kentucky, which has partisan voter registration, have what's often referred to as a semi-open primary. In these 10 states, Republicans still can only vote in the Republican primary. Democrats can still only vote in the Democratic primary, but independent voters, and I'm gonna get to that in a minute, why this is so important. Independent voters can pick a ballot. So I know we mentioned, just as we started, Celeste from Colorado. So, Colorado has, in 2016, adopted this form of open primary. Independents can pick one or the other ballot and participate in the primary election. And then there are 4 states that have dispensed with party primary elections altogether. So in these 4 states, there's no longer a Republican primary and a Democratic primary. There's simply one public primary. All the candidates are on one ballot. All the voters get to vote. In the case of California, Washington, and the Nebraska unicameral, the top 2 vote getters move on to the general election, and Alaska gets the top 4. And then, of course, there's 12 states with completely closed primaries like Kentucky has. In these states, Republicans, like I said before, vote in the Republican primary, Democrats in the Democratic primary. Everybody else has to wait till the general election. They are essentially disenfranchised from participating in the primary. Now, open nonpartisan primaries are the dominant form of election when it comes to our cities. So 85% of our cities around the country have open nonpartisan elections for local office, including in Kentucky, where all but 6 cities, including Louisville, all city council, mayoral, and school board elections, as I'm sure you've experienced in your voting, are open and nonpartisan. Everybody gets to participate. Now, why is this important? The issue of open primaries. Well, a few years ago, you probably hadn't heard about the issue of open primaries. It's become more and more central to the debate over election reform in this country. And that's because of 2 key changes in our elections that have happened over roughly the last 20 years. The first is the growth of independent voters. So you can see these are national numbers that, not that long ago, independent voters were a small fraction of the electorate. In fact, when primaries were first created 100 years ago, they almost didn't exist at all. Today, independent voters are the largest group of voters in the country, the largest, and they are also the fastest growing group of voters in the country. So we now have a situation where party primaries, closed party primaries, are shutting out the largest and fastest growing group of voters in the country. Now, what does that look like in Kentucky? Well, in Kentucky, there's over 350,000 registered independent voters that are now shut out of the primaries. That's 10% of all Kentucky voters. So 1 out of 10 Kentucky voters today can't participate in the primaries. They're also the fastest growing group of voters in Kentucky. They're growing twice as fast as Republicans. And just to see how fast, 20 years ago, there were almost half as many independents in the state of Kentucky as there is now. So in 20 years, they've doubled in their share of the electorate. Who are independent voters? Well, they're a cross-section of everybody, but there's a few groups that really stand out. First and foremost are young people. 50%, over 50% of millennial and Gen Z voters are independent, over 50%. And that really presents a real sea change in the way young people are looking at the parties and their relationship with the parties. When I was growing up, you joined the party that your family were members of. Today, that's just not the case at all. Young people are going out in a new direction. Less and less of them are joining the parties, and even, quite frankly, the ones that are joining the parties and interacting with the parties in very different ways than their parents and grandparents did. Our veterans, a lot of people don't know this. Half our veterans are independent voters. Rocky Bleier, this is a picture of the great Rocky Bleier. He was a 4-time Super Bowl champion with the Pittsburgh Steelers. He's also a Purple Heart Medal winner from the Vietnam War. As Rocky says in his quote, veterans are independent voters, and they are now shut out. And he says, when I've talked to him, he says, when you go to fight for your country, you don't go to fight for red America or blue America. You go to fight for red, white, and blue America. And many veterans, as a result, come out of their service and register unaffiliated, and they're shut out in closed partisan primaries. And then increasingly growing communities of color are shut out in closed primaries. A third of Latinos and African Americans, almost half of Asian Americans, and an increasing number of Native Americans all are shut out of primaries because they are registered as independent or unaffiliated, depending on how the state characterizes them. So I just talked about how the rise of independent voters is a big factor in the debate over needing to open the primaries to now the largest and fastest growing group of voters. But there's a second piece to this, why it's become increasingly important. And that is the abject decline of competition in our general election races. So if you were to turn on the news when you're during election season, during the November election, you'll see them covering all the real close races between Democrats and Republicans. Who wins that race? Who wins that race? That's actually a very, very small piece of elections in this country. Most elections in this country are completely uncompetitive. So I want to show you what that looks like in Kentucky, because Kentucky is actually very representative, unfortunately, of what general election races look like in much of America today. So these are statistics from the Kentucky general election for state legislature, the Senate and in the House. And as you can see, in both the House and Senate races in 2022, almost half the races were uncontested. So that means when you went into the ballot box to vote for state Senate or for state House, you had a 50% chance, depending on your district, to only see one person's name on the ballot. There really wasn't even any reason to vote. That person would be guaranteed to move on and win that seat. Very few of these races are actually competitive, meaning that the percentage difference between the winner and the second place winner was a close horse race. So you see, in the state Senate, not a single race in 2022 was considered competitive, not a single one. In the House, just 4%. And so the picture that you see is a situation where a growing number of people can't participate in the primaries, but the primaries are now, as a result of this significant drop in competition in the general election, increasingly becoming the elections that matter. These are the elections where the candidates that are most likely to go on and win an uncompetitive general election race are going to be selected. This is where their agendas are set. This is where the issues get debated. So participation in the primaries is increasingly becoming an important subject of debate about how do we start to make our elections more inclusive, and how do we start to break down the increasing partisanship and polarization that we find not just in Kentucky, but in every state around the country. Well, why is that? Why have our elections become increasing, and our candidates and our politicians become increasingly polarized? Well, in many respects, they're doing exactly what you would expect to happen when you have closed primaries that meet some of the other trends that I just described. Because you have a smaller and smaller group of people in the primaries as the fastest growing group of voters is shut out, smaller and smaller group of people that that our candidates and then our elected leaders actually have to listen to in order to get elected and stay in office. They don't have to pay attention to their entire constituency because, as I said before, in the general election, many of them are just guaranteed to sail through. So it's the primary voters that our candidates and elected officials are most attuned to paying attention to and following. And that's why closed primaries in many ways are strengthening the partisanship in our country and disenfranchising so many of the people that need to participate. What would an open primary mean? Well, at its very basic, we saw there's different forms, but it's very basic. In an open primary, every voter gets to vote. So the fastest growing group of voters in the country gets to participate. Voter participation goes up. I'll talk about that in a second. Candidates and politicians in an open primary are forced to reach out to and be accountable to a larger group of their constituents instead of the partisan few. And it ends the taxpayer funding of exclusionary elections. That's something that's really important to understand. one of the things you'll hear most often from in the debate over opening versus closing the primaries is, well, these are the party's primaries. And, you know, I noted at the beginning of this presentation how historically it was never meant to be the party's primaries. But even considering how they operate now, you have to ask yourself, in what respect are they the party's primaries? Primary elections in the state of Kentucky and in every state are taxpayer funded. These are publicly funded elections. The parties don't pay for them. The public does. Every member of the public through their taxes pays for these primary elections. And they don't just pay for them. They're run by the state. So in Kentucky, they're run by the state. Election workers are paid for by the state. The entire the election machines, the entire operation. When you experience a primary election, it's largely identical to your experience of a general election. That's because it is identical. It's run by the state in the exact same way. So this idea that these are the party's primaries is a narrative that is starting to deteriorate as these types of issues of taxpayer funding, of independent voters are becoming more and more understood and appreciated. This is just a report that came out just a few months ago from the Commission on Political Reform. It's a bipartisan commission, not bipartisan, nonpartisan commission. They did a study of different forms of primaries around the country, and they found one simple fact, that states with open primaries have higher voter turnout, period. And it's not hard to understand why. When everybody has the right to vote, you're going to get more people to vote. It's just that simple. As we know, in so many ways and shapes and forms, voter suppression laws are designed, and tactics, they're designed to keep the number of people voting low. That means elections are more controllable, they're more predictable, but that's really not democracy. Open primaries and closed primaries are in the similar vein a form of voter suppression. Open primaries helps open up the system and give everybody access to a taxpayer-funded election. So that's the basics. I'm happy to answer anybody's questions. There's a lot going on in the country right now. Many different states, what you would call red states, blue states, purple states, all around the country are grappling with the issue of primary reform. And I'm happy to talk about that, what that looks like in more detail if folks are interested, but I'm happy to answer any questions you have.
So, Mr. Gruber, I did put a question in the chat. It says, well, it was direct to you. It says, at the end, when you're ready, would you please describe the process that would need to take place in Kentucky for it to become an open primary state? Thank you.
Sure. So I believe, and please, I'm not a Kentucky expert, so correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe Kentucky does not have ballot initiatives. So for the primaries to be open, a bill would have to move through the legislature to allow them to open. Maine, for example, just passed legislation last year through the legislature to allow independent voters to participate in the primaries. That's what's called a semi-open primary. So it is, New Mexico got very close this year. They're going back next year through the legislature. So it certainly is possible, and it has been done to get open primaries through the legislature. As I mentioned, Colorado earlier, they passed an open primary in 2016 by ballot initiative. So there's various ways to do it. In Kentucky, it would definitely have to be through the legislature.
And on that, there was also a question in the chat, actually, I think Kathleen also asked this, but do you think that more voters would register as independent in Kentucky if there were nonpartisan open primaries?
Probably. What happens in a closed system? It's funny because parties like to say, well, we only want our party members to participate in a closed primary. But think about what that actually means. In a closed system, what tends to happen is folks who don't really associate with the parties, who don't think of themselves as members of the parties, often are forced to register with the parties in order to participate in the primaries. And that happens all the time. So I would argue that actually, yes, you would see more independents, but the number of independents in the state wouldn't go up. They would just be free to actually, for the first time, be able to declare who they are. And so you would see a lot of independents who are registered with the parties, register independent, along with the 10% of independents that already do. So it's in many ways, it's a very valuable sorting process. People can fully identify politically with their beliefs for the first time.
Elizabeth?
Maybe this is too much for this conversation, but what kind of strategy do you use in a state like Kentucky where the dominant party has everything to lose and nothing to gain by moving to open primaries?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, we just had this conversation in Maine, where the dominant party is the Democratic Party, and we're able to pass it through. But we work in a lot of Republican. In fact, the majority of the states we work in tend to be Republican-led states. I think there's a number of arguments. I think perhaps the most important argument is why so many people right of center are open primary supporters in the first place. And that is because, unlike so many other election reforms, primary reform and open primaries is a values-based reform. It's about fundamental fairness. It's about one person, one vote. It's about competition. It's about many of the core values that conservatives talk about and embrace every day. So it's an unusual reform in that respect, that it's really about fairness and values. But I would also argue, particularly in a state like Kentucky, you are surrounded on all sides by states with open primaries. And you are also surrounded on all sides by many states with a dominant Republican Party like you have in Kentucky. And they're doing just great. In fact, many of the leaders of the Republican Party in many of these states credit, open primaries with their ability to early on build relationships with independent voters that bring them into the fold. Look, open primaries doesn't change the political makeup of a state. Red states tend to stay red, blue states stay blue, purple states stay purple. Open primaries aren't going to change the political makeup of the state. What they do, though, is they open more space for people to share their views. And in states across the South with open primaries, that means that independents, Republicans can reach out to independents early, build relationships, and a lot of them credit their ascendancy to their ability to do that. So it's actually not in no way, shape, or form is this a way to challenge them. It's really a way to make their party more responsive, more inclusive, and therefore, in the long term, more successful. Because again, independent voters aren't going away. They've doubled in size in Kentucky. They are continuing to grow. They grow about 1% a year. So they're going to increasingly become a significant portion of the public. And any party, whether it be in a Republican-dominated state, a Democratic Party-dominated state, or a state where they're at parity, any party that neglects or ignores the fastest growing group of voters in the country does so at its long-term political peril, in my opinion.
Have you seen that that more third-party candidates win if there are open primaries?
Well, they certainly have a fair shake. Look, open primaries at its core, I said, is about letting all voters vote. It's not about candidate access as much as it is about voter access. But certainly, when systems become, the more open a system is, the more opportunity there is for everyone, voters, candidates alike. Particularly among the more advanced open primary systems, the nonpartisan primary systems, like they have in Washington or Alaska. Certainly in those systems, candidates from third parties or independent candidates have a greater opportunity to gain access, because as I'm sure you know, so much of our election laws are designed to keep them in a third part, in a secondary status and away from any type of legitimate competition. So it really kind of depends. The degree really depends on the type of primary, but the more open the system in general means there's more opportunity for everybody.
So Chris Harmer had asked this question very early on, and I think it was in relation to like our situation here in Kentucky. But speak up if this is not correct. But he was asking what happens to third party candidates. So I think that was in relation to like how our primaries are now in Kentucky.
Right. Well, it depends on the type of open primary. So if you were to have the type of open, the most basic type of open primary, where you still have party primaries, but independent voters get to pick a ballot, or in the case of states with nonpartisan voter registration, everybody. There's less of an effect on third party candidates. It's really more about access to all voters to the ballot.
So I think, sorry, I think this was I think it was a question more about our closed primary system. I think they're trying to understand like what happens to third party candidates right now and the way our
in a closed system, third party candidates, assuming they meet the requirements to be recognized as a party, then they generally directly go onto the general election ballot along with whoever's selected in the primary from the major parties.
When I met with the executive director of the league in Maine, she said that the strongest argument they had in getting passage of open primaries in Maine was the fact that they're taxpayer funded. It was a question of equity, which you touched on, Jeremy. But she said, in talking with members of both parties, that and with the public in general, that argument seemed to have more impact than almost any other one you could. The fact that taxpayers are paying for it, and it's only fair that everybody can vote.
Well, that's exactly right, Fran. That's oftentimes our strongest argument. And you have to appreciate the scale of what we're talking about here. Primaries cost taxpayers in Kentucky millions of dollars to administer. This is not a frivolous expense. This is a serious use of taxpayer dollars. Don't forget, we fought a revolution under the banner of no taxation without representation. And yet here we have a situation where we have primaries funded by many of the people who can't participate in them. And that notion of fundamental fairness is something that many people find objectionable, and including, Elizabeth, to your earlier question, a large number of conservatives who find it highly unfair and objectionable to be paying taxes for an exclusionary election that only a small number of people are privileged to participate in.
So there's a question thinking of states that have adopted open primaries recently, who are the instigators, the advocate groups pushing for such reforms?
Well, that's a great question, and I'm glad we're doing it in this forum, because one of the key groups that's been doing this all around the country has been the League of Women Voters. They were a key ally in Maine. They were an ally in Colorado, and we've been working. We've been working with the League of Women Voters actually in a number of southern states where there's been legislation, because they, of course, have open primaries. There are certain elements of certain members that are trying to close them. Some of the more extreme elements of some of these states are trying to close the primaries. And we've been working actually with the League of Women Voters in Tennessee, Missouri, and other states to address that legislation and make sure it doesn't pass. So the League of Women Voters has been a really important ally at the state level. My understanding is that there's no national position on this, but on a state-by-state basis, many League of Women Voters have been active. And it's really been sort of a large number of different groups, everywhere from civil rights groups and voting rights, sort of traditional civil rights, voting rights groups, to more to newer political reform groups, community groups. They've been sort of an unusual coalitions have developed on a state-by-state basis. There really is no sort of common formula, other than the fact that they want to make sure everybody can vote.
So, we recently had redistricting, and so we really fought for having fair maps here in Kentucky, and actually some of our volunteers learned the software, put together maps, and suggested them to the legislature. And so this question is about what is the impact of open primaries on the impact of legal gerrymandering?
Yeah, well, in many ways, the way I like to think about it, they're really two sides of the same coin, right? The point for both issues is that politicians should not be picking their voters. And gerrymandering, they do it by the way they draw districts. In primaries, they do it by the way they decide who can and can't participate in the primary. But both systems are designed to keep the right kind of voters voting for the politicians, so that they don't have to be truly accountable to the people to their constituents that live around them. And so they don't interact directly, but they really are mirror images of each other in terms of how reforming both are so critical to ensuring that every voter has an equal say with every other voter in who our candidates are.
Jeremy, could you give us a sort of a brief rundown on the different types of open primaries that are being used? I mean, I know there's a lot of them, but I mean, just generally, it's one thing to say you want open primaries, but there's a number of ways of accomplishing that.
Yeah, I touched on this at the beginning. I'll go through it really quickly again, because I think it's important to understand what's possible and what's out there. There's essentially three forms of open primaries. The first is the dominant form in the South. That combines nonpartisan voter registration with an open primary. In that form of primary, you don't register as a party member or independent or a third party member. You simply register with the state as a voter. You still have party primaries, Republican and Democrat major party primaries, but every voter, by virtue of it being nonpartisan voter registration, every voter gets to pick a party ballot and participate in the primary. For that form of primary to be implemented in Kentucky, it would require two changes, not just an open primary, but a move from what Kentucky currently has, which is partisan voter registration, right? You register Republican, Democrat, et cetera. You would actually have to implement nonpartisan voter registration for that specific model. 10 states have what's called a semi-open primary. These are all states that have partisan voter registration, like Kentucky. In these states, they do one thing and one thing simply. Independent voters can pick a party ballot, period. So if you are registered as an independent voter in these states, you can pick the Democratic ballot or the Republican ballot in the primary, one or the other, and participate as an independent voter in that primary election. And then the third and sort of, what I would call the most dramatic and form of change in terms of primaries, what's called a nonpartisan primary. In a nonpartisan primary, like Kentucky has for most municipal elections already, there's no longer a Republican primary or a Democratic primary. They dispense with party primaries altogether. There's simply one tax-funded public primary. All the candidates are on one ballot. They can have their party affiliation next to their name. You know who they are. But all the candidates are on one ballot, and the top vote getters, depending on the state, they have different numbers of what constitutes the top vote getters. But the top vote getters from the primary move on to the general election and compete. So those are the three most common forms of open primaries. I would suggest, particularly in states where you're working without ballot initiatives, the nonpartisan primary can be particularly challenging to get through a legislature. The most common form of primary, most recently that's been enacted through the legislature, like I described in Maine earlier, is the semi-open primary, which would maintain the partisan voter registration that Kentucky currently has, but simply allow independent voters for the first time to participate and pick a party ballot.
There's another question. Have there been any court cases about the exclusion of independents from the closed primaries?
You know, that's a great question. There should be more. There have been a handful of cases. We're working to bring more litigation in this area to delineate, you know, how far we can get into the courts on this issue. Most of the focus of reformers to date has really been in enacting laws through legislature or ballot initiative, not in litigating them. But we're hoping to change that and bring more litigation in the future. A lot has changed, actually. You know, there's been, like I said, there's been a handful of court cases. They're relatively older, from the 1980s or before. The world has changed quite a bit since the 1980s. Independent voters were a fraction of the voting population at that time. They're now the dominant number of voters nationally. And so we believe the litigation on this area would be quite fruitful now that the reality has changed, but we still have to pursue it.
Elizabeth?
I'm not 100% sure about this, but I'm about 90% sure. In Kentucky, how we register and how the primaries are ran is part of our Constitution. Would there be a way to, I mean, with it being in the Constitution, would there be a place for a lawsuit?
I couldn't, you know, I'll be honest with you, I'm not as familiar, Elizabeth, with the Kentucky Constitution, but I'm more than happy to review it and offer an opinion at a later point.
There was another question. Let's see. Let me scroll up here. It was about, oh yeah, here we go. So this question was about, they like the idea of a nonpartisan open primary or ranked choice voting. Partisan open primary seems like it could, I guess, a party in a position of supporting someone who may not agree with the party platform or values. It also seems like it would be subject to tactical voting to undermine the other party with bad candidates. Has that been studied, and how often that takes place in partisan open primaries? I guess this is kind of like the what do they call it? Like the
So this
false voter.
There's been sometimes you'll hear these allegations of sort of tactical voting. First of all, it's important to understand that those allegations even the allegations themselves are actually only attendant to a particular form of open primary, and that's the one where they combine nonpartisan voter registration with an open primary. Because in those cases, you might have people who view themselves as Democrats, but of course, in the eyes of the state, they're just a voter, and they may want to vote in the Republican primary. Some folks call that tactical voting. I call that democracy. If you are a voter, in my mind, particularly if you're a voter in a state that is so dominated by one party, the only opportunity for you in a state like that to be able to express your political beliefs is in the dominant party's primary. It's the only place where your vote matters, has any meaning whatsoever. So, you know, I wouldn't be surprised if some people do it. The truth, though, is that this has been studied quite extensively, and tactical voting does not happen in any meaningful way. And that's because that's something really important about voting more generally. people don't waste their vote, and they certainly don't use their vote in ways that are frivolous. People vote. People take their vote very seriously, and in case after case, in study after study, we see people are voting based upon their beliefs, based upon who they want to win, as they should, as is their right. But using their vote in ways that are nefarious or unfortunate, or it just doesn't happen in any meaningful way. It happens. I mean, there's all kinds of things that happen in elections, but not in any way that matters, not in any way that's substantive or meaningful, or in any sort of amount that is consequential to the outcome of an election. People care about voting, and they want to vote in a way that is most impactful. That is why, like we said before, in a closed system, you'll see a lot of people registering with parties that they don't actually even agree with. They're forced. Think about this. Talk about constitutional. They're forced to associate with a party they may not even agree with, because they want to participate in an election that's going to determine who the representatives are. That's not the way our elections should be. We should be able to register however we want and vote in every publicly funded election. That's what I believe. That's what our organization believes, and that's what we've been fighting for.
So Becky Jones asked, what time frame do you see when a state decides to move from a closed to an open primary system? Like, how long does that realistically take?
Oh, it can, it really differs state by state. I mean, it's determined by how much support within the state there you start with, how much has to be built through public education and organizing and understanding. So it's really hard to give a one size fits all number. I can tell you, for example, in the state of Maine, this is the most recent campaign that I worked on that was successfully run through a state legislature. It took about 6 years from beginning public education and holding forums and talking to people and learning from people, as well as teaching people, and then starting to introduce legislation and building support among members, and getting committee hearings, and then moving on to getting a floor vote, and so on and so forth. It took about 6 years in Maine. I couldn't predict what it might take in Kentucky. But it all starts with public education. It all starts with talking to people like we're doing in this conversation, so they understand how primary elections currently work, and what the concerns are, and how that can change and be made more inclusive.
So Jeremy, would you be willing to share your email address in the chat if any of us have questions after this, or want future updates
Sure.
on what's happening in the various states? Thank you.
Yeah.
I think we have time for like one more question, and then we'll close out. So Elizabeth is asking, is there value in starting off supporting a semi-open primary for independents first, since there seems to be some support in that by the Republican Party?
People, every time I work in a state, I often get the question, well, what type of primary should we do? And my answer is always, that's for the people of your state to decide. It's not for me to tell you. I think all forms of open primaries have merit. Some are more politically viable than others, depending upon how you're trying to enact them. But in the end, my suggestion is, don't start the conversation with, we want to do this form of open primary. My suggestion is to start the conversation as to why are closed primaries broken, and how can we work to build consensus about how to fix them. If you start there, you're much more likely to get a broader discussion and a broader buy-in, and let the conversations you are having with your fellow Kentucky voters, let those conversations inform where you go next.
Well, thank you so much. And I think that is a wonderful task for us. I mean, we are, friends are going to be leading this study for us to really ask these questions and to learn more about it, and to kind of really examine, like, how is this affecting our electorate? how can we serve our electorate better? How can we make democracy work? So Fran, did you have any last comments that you wanted to say?
Well, I did want to ask Jeremy, are you willing to share the slides that you used tonight with us, Jeremy?
Oh, sure. I'm happy. I'll send you an email with this presentation.
That'd be great. They'd be a great resource.
And please, for all of you, we are an open source organization, and please call on me and my organization for anything you need as you continue this conversation.
Well, we thank you, and I thank all of you for joining us on this Zoom. It's a lot for us to think about, but it's a wonderful introduction, and you really helped us, Jeremy, lay the groundwork for this. So without any other business, thank you and good night to everybody.
I just also want to mention I put an evaluation in the chat. So if you want to click on that and give us feedback about the presentation tonight, we would greatly appreciate that. And thank you so much, everybody.
Right, and it is recorded. So if you know of people who were unable to join us, why we do have it recorded, right, Jen?
Yes, and we will be posting that on our website, but we'll also be posting it on our League in Action app. So if anybody wants to learn more about the League, get involved with the League and take action, there's tons of information on the app. In fact, you can share voter registration is open now. You can share voter registration. We'll be sending out election reminders. So it gets a little complicated here in Kentucky about when you can request your absentee ballot, if you're eligible for it, when all those things have to be turned in, when early voting starts. We will keep you on track by giving you little phone reminders about that stuff. Plus, you can learn just more about the work that we do. And, this study on open primaries and ranked choice voting is just one aspect of the League work that we do. And so it's an excellent opportunity to kind of just scope it out and kind of look for different opportunities where you might be interested in volunteering. Well, thank you so much, everybody. I appreciate your time, and we'll talk to you soon. Thanks. Bye.